I know how to do this. We did this before, so it worked. Okay, there you go. Can everybody see my screen? Perfect. So thank you so much, Matthew, Gunter, and Tom, for inviting me. I have to say I'm a little bit intimidated by the fact that I'm presenting to a attention and Buddhism research group. I do not specialize in Buddhism. What I'm hoping to offer you rather today is a comparison between the philosophy that I know better, which is that of Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil, and an idea of an ethics of attention that they're developing. But because Zen Buddhism makes an appearance in Iris Murdoch's work, and I think it's actually helpful to understand certain difficulties that both Murdoch and Weil face with regards to the self, I thought it would be useful to draw in Buddhism to look at the different ways in which we can understand this problem of the self in attention. So this is what I'm going to do. I'll give you a brief outline of the talk. So I'll start by saying something about why attention is ethically important, which is, I think, an idea that's becoming more and more accepted, but it's by no means obvious. There are many ways to think about the moral relevance of attention. And there are ways to doubt that attention has moral relevance if we take attention in a fairly broad sense as just any way we direct our consciousness. And because Iris Murdoch, drawing on Simone Weil, is the philosopher in the past century who most explicitly developed this line of thought, I will extrapolate some ideas from her and try to develop them in a way that makes it perhaps a little bit more systematic, a little bit more orderly, so that we can then engage with it. The main idea about the morality of attention is its truth-seeking element. So I'll spend some time talking about how attention and truth-seeking are related. And on the other hand, this truth-seeking goes hand in hand with what Murdoch calls unselfing and Weil calls decreation, which takes us to considering three conceptions of the self in attention. How do we understand this unselfing or decreation in attention? And this is when Zen becomes helpful. And then I'll conclude by thinking a little bit about how do we apply this framework to the attention economy? How can an ethics of attention, which in this case is mostly focused on the individual, be relevant for us to think about how to work with our attention when it seems that it's being hijacked or threatened. So the ethics of attention is part of Murdoch's overall philosophical project. And now I just want to give you an overview of Murdoch's ideas so that we understand why attention fits and why attention is, in a sense, a revolutionary concept in ethics. In the context of a moral philosophy, particularly in Anglophone moral philosophy from the 20th century onwards, which is very much focused on what is external, on action, on deliberation leading to action, and on fixed and universal principles, which the main moral theories suggest. Now, Murdoch's attention is the idea that we need to take ethics back from action to quality of consciousness, that we will not really be clear about our moral quality, but also about moral thinking if we only look at what leads to action, at deliberation and action. So Murdoch stressed that we need to pay attention, not just to what we do, not even just to our intentions, but to what she called the background of consciousness, which is this unshaped mass of desires, emotions, ideas, vague thoughts, intuitions, that together shape what we see in the world. And if we don't have a clear idea of what it is that shapes the kind of vision that we have and the scope of our vision, then we will not fully understand why we act as we do, why we think as we do in particular contexts. So this background of consciousness is something out of which individual judgments and thoughts emerge, but it's also something that shapes, it gives a particular delineation to the world that we see, the way in which we understand specific situations, and how we see them. Murdoch's idea of attention comes from Simone Weil. And even though on a quick reading, it will seem that Murdoch is just borrowing a concept from Weil, bless you, and using it in a more secular context, because Simone Weil, if people are not familiar with Weil, was very much a Christian mystical thinker. She was a philosopher, but she was also a mystic, and her idea of attention is grounded in a Christian metaphysics. Murdoch doesn't have that metaphysics. Murdoch is interested in a secular kind of ethics. She's interested in mysticism, but what she wants to propose is an ethics that can be accepted by those who do not have any belief. So it's interesting that Murdoch seems to take attention directly from Weil, and she doesn't specify exactly how attention changes once it's inserted in her philosophy. And that's one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about. But both philosophers place attention at the center of their ethics. For Murdoch, it's mostly at the center of her secular ethics. For Weil, it's at the center of her ethics and also of her metaphysics. What struck Murdoch, I think, particularly about Weil's idea of attention is that precisely it played into her own project of taking morality back to consciousness and of stressing everything that shapes particular thoughts and actions, rather than just the act of the will, which seems to be difficult to explain unless we take that background into account. And so she argued in Against Dryness, which is an early essay, that we need a new vocabulary of attention. We need to reshape our way of thinking about morality around this new vocabulary that we develop about attention. And here is Murdoch again saying that she's borrowing attention from Simone Weil. And here she gives a very famous definition of attention, which is the idea of a just and loving gaze directed upon an individual reality. Now, this is something that anyone who's familiar with Murdoch will be sick of hearing, but I'm not taking for granted that anybody in the audience here is particularly familiar with either Murdoch or Weil. But so this is important. It's a definition of attention that wouldn't strike somebody as being the ordinary concept of attention. What does love have to do with attention? What does justice have to do with attention? So I think that love and justice do have a lot to do with attention as we ordinarily understand it, but we need to do a little bit of digging. What's important for us now, for the moment, is that Murdoch is suggesting that attention is both a characteristic mark of the moral agent, which means that the active moral agent is somebody who attends, and that it's a proper mark of the moral agent, which means that to be a moral agent, we ought to attend. It's something that we need to be able to cultivate. And by saying that, it means that attention, the capacity to attend, is by no means something we can take for granted, and it's not something that we exercise all the time. And that goes against views of attention, which take it to be a constant element of consciousness. So if attention is what grounds our understanding of our intuitions, our shaping of concepts, our will and our intentions, and then our actions, then it makes sense that attention is foundational for morality. It comes before everything else. And understanding attention takes us much further in understanding everything else that we more narrowly call the context of morality. And here I would like to propose, based on my book, which is in a way an extension of Murdoch and Weil's ideas, two axes upon which we can understand the moral import of attention, which I call the horizontal and the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is the one that I think we're more familiar with because it concerns the object of our attention, what it is that we attend to. And the relevance of that for morality is that what we attend to has consequences both for the quality and for the direction of our consciousness, which is also moral consciousness. And that's true for every little act of attention, which cumulatively builds up to shaping ourselves, our consciousness, and our character in different ways. For instance, attending frequently to something like climate change news will make that problem more salient in our consciousness, so it will be more likely for us to be concerned with it. As a consequence, what we attend to also shapes our motivation. If we attend a lot to climate change news, then we will be more motivated to act to change it. And that goes for those objects which seem to have inbuilt a motivational element, such as suffering. Attending to suffering will make us more motivated, will give us an initial motivation to act and do something about it. And finally, the objects of our attention also provide inspiration for us. And this is something that Murdoch stresses. For example, attending to good things or examples of goodness will give us a better idea in our own minds of what it means to be good, what it means to be inspired by goodness, and therefore it will give these good objects or these good exemplars a more prominent place in our minds. But there is also a vertical axis, which is something that is much more controversial and therefore also less discussed when it comes to the ethics of attention. And that's got to do with whether or not we attend. Now, this is only possible to claim on a view of attention where attention is not ubiquitous, which is very much the view that both Weil and Murdoch propose. So here attention becomes clearer if we understand what it's contrasted with, which could be distraction. Either we are dividing our attention so much that none of the object gets a proper place in our consciousness. We can contrast attention with reverie, which is something that William James does, and understand attention as a more focused state of mind, whereas reverie seems to be a lack of attention on anything in particular. But we can also contrast attention with an instrumental kind of seeking, with the state of mind in which we're trying to get out of the world. We're trying to get something out of the world for ourselves. And this is probably the most important contrast of attention based on Murdoch and Weil's model, and the most controversial one. Because I think ordinarily we are used to talking about attending to somebody, for example, in order to exploit them or manipulate them. Now, for Murdoch and Weil, this would not exactly be attention. And let's see why. The main and most important reason is that attention has a truth-seeking element built in. The well-known etymology of attention, ad tendere, it means that it contains attention towards something. It's an inner and mental tension towards something else. So that means that if we need to tend towards something else, something that's outside of us, when we attend, there is something that we don't know in a very non-demanding sense of knowledge. There is something that we need to know when we don't already have that kind of knowledge. Whether it's just the immediate knowledge of, is that car coming towards me when you hear honking in the street? Or it's a richer kind of knowledge, whether you're trying to, for example, understand whether your friend is upset after losing a job. There is something that reality can give us and we don't have. And so in this very basic and broad sense, the aim of attention is to discover that something that we don't know. And that has to be truth, because that truth, and we can talk about what we mean by truth in philosophical context. Murdoch has her own definition of truth. The truth is here understood as that which I do not create, that which I do not make. So, and again, in a not necessarily metaphysically demanding sense, truth is whatever it is that I am not myself manipulating or shaping. It's contrasted with fantasy for Murdoch. So this tension towards something, towards truth, is defined by Murdoch as Eros. So both Murdoch and Weil are Platonists. And Plato here plays an important part in shaping the understanding of attention, because Eros is the driving force of attention as Murdoch understands it. So Eros here is desire, desire for what is true, desire for our soul, to use the language of the symposium, to be filled by the object. And so for Murdoch, Eros here, as she defines in Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, is a spiritual pilgrimage inspired by the disturbing magnetism of truth. We are disturbed by the realization that we're always some steps removed from truth. And attention is precisely the expression of this desire to be filled by the object, to get closer to the truth, which is, of course, always a progressive and never completed endeavor. Now, Weil has a similar but even more metaphysically heavy conception of attention as something that gives us the truth. And here we're beginning to see the contrast, which I'm going to stress in a minute, between truth and self, truth and subjectivity. Again, very famous definition of attention for Weil, which you can find in the essay Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies, is attention as a man on a mountain who sees underneath him all the pines and forests, but has a bigger look. He can see the whole landscape in front of him. And so attention for Weil consists of suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. And I think here we can already see the seeds of some of the comparison with Zen that I would like to draw. Our thought should be waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object that is to penetrate it. So Weil here is introducing the idea that as long as we are seeking something, we are introducing too much of ourselves, of our desires into the object, and therefore we will never receive it in its truth. And Weil's ideal, which in most cases can be nothing more than an ideal, is to see reality naked, as if we were not there, which is an interesting contrast to Murdoch, because it's a stripping of all subjectivity, which Murdoch rejects. But for now, what's important is that if attention is truth-seeking and is motivated consciously or unconsciously by some kind of eros or desire for truth, then attention is inherently valuable. So there is no bad attention on this model, because every time that attention proper is exercised, we are on the one hand moving closer to the truth, which in the Platonic tradition is also good, and at the same time moving away from selfishness, self-concern, confusion, fantasy. So on the one hand, we have a fundamentally non-instrumental nature of attention. We cannot be truly paying attention on this model if we are trying to use what we're paying attention to. And on the other hand, there is an opening towards the other, towards the hell that is not other people, but is oneself. Away from the hell that is oneself, towards the other, towards the world, which is an occasion for discovery that every single act of attention presents to us. Again, ethical for Murdoch, ethical and spiritual for Weil. If you believe that the world is God-made, then of course, every little thing that we discover about the world will be a direction towards being part of this greater reality. And Murdoch understands this, and this is where she comes closer to a very mystical kind of spirituality, where she says that everything about us asks for our attention. The world of nature and ordinary artifacts is full of potential points of light, of worlds within the world. I think it's a very beautiful quote. So if attention moves us towards the truth, it's fueled by the desire to know, and if what is outside of us is something that can be properly understood, only if we take a step back, then we have the contrast between the objects of our attention, the reality, and the self. Now, both Murdoch and Weil see the self as an interference, as the interference between clear vision and true knowledge and our own consciousness. And that's why both, in a sense, aspire to something that we can call pure consciousness with many qualifications. We need to remove something about the self or the self in its entirety in order to be properly attentive. Again, it's an aspirational notion. It's something never to be fully realized. But this is something that we need to hold in front of ourselves. Murdoch calls this removal of the interference of the self in attention unselfing. Weil calls it decreation, because for Weil, very quickly, the very existence of a self is our own acceptance of being created and therefore interfering with the fullness of being that is God. We can talk about this later because it's way too quick. But anyway, for Weil, the removal of the self takes the shape of the rejection of a creation, which is in a way of interfering with reality. Murdoch is less demanding. she's only requiring that we remove whatever it is that interferes with our understanding of the world. But in both cases, we have a normativity of attention. Attention being that which makes us less selfish for Murdoch, or less of a self for Weil. And it's the effort, as Murdoch puts it, to counteract states of illusion. And here also we have Murdoch below. Realism required for goodness, there is no goodness without realism for her, is an ability to perceive what is true, attention, which is automatically at the same time suppression of self. So attention and self do not coexist. If you're attending, then you're not allowing yourself to take center stage. If you're allowing yourself to take center stage, you're not attending. And what is interesting is that Murdoch talks about not just a suppression of the self, but a direction of attention. And this is where sometimes her usage of the word attention oscillates between different meanings, and we need to be careful to pick the ones that are more consistent with her overall philosophy. She says that the direction of attention is towards the great surprising variety of the world, away from the self, and the ability to direct attention this way is love. So what this means is that for Murdoch, the self doesn't need to be entirely removed. We only need to be able to change our attention, but I think it would be better here to say our focus, and move it away from ourselves, which is going to be distorting, and it's going to fill the world with our fantasies, towards what is other. With Weil, we have a more radical view. The self as such is an illusion. And what we need is not just a change of direction, but an impersonal vision, to see his landscape as it is when I am not there. And this is where Zen becomes interesting, because both Murdoch and Weil, in their different ways of approaching the self, still regard the self as a kind of enemy, as something to be suppressed and something to be removed. And in that way, they seem to display a kind of attachment, even if it's a negative attachment to the idea of a self, which in turn will be an interference to attention. And that's where Zen helps, because in Zen, we don't have an idea of a substantial self like Murdoch does, but also we don't have a metaphysical theory of the self like Weil does. And this is, I think, what a theory, well, a view rather than a theory, that allows our attention to be more fully directed to what is outer. Because if we attend without any idea of suppressing the self, if we only realize that by attending, automatically we are not interfering with the reality with ourselves, because there is nothing that we need to remove, there is no substantial self that we need to remove, then our attention can be fuller, and it can be more properly attention in the way that both Murdoch and Weil demand. So the removal of dualism can be an important mental attitude for our practical exercise of attention to be successful. Now, Murdoch is interested in Zen. She mentions Sekida and Zen training, which is what she read in Metaphysics on the Guide to Morals, but she is wary. She understands the lack of dualism. She understands the idea that in attention, you can remove your thinking. And she draws parallels between Zen and Simone Weil, but ultimately she cannot accept the disinterest and disengagement with the self that Zen seems to be proposing. So here we have three forms of attention as understood against the self. As I said, we have Murdoch, where attention is not exactly unselfing, but is no self-concern, but the self remains. We have Weil, where attention is more radical. It's the idea that we have to renounce subjectivity and dissolve the self into the tissue of reality, which, if you like, we can call God. And then we have the Zen idea of the self, where it's non-duality. And in the words of Masao Abe, rejects both eternalism and nihilism. So attention is a practice here that reveals reality, part of which is an illusory nature of the substantial self. So in Zen, we can progressively dissolve any focus on the self to make room for the object. And that gives primacy to attention, because here we don't need to have a theory of the self to understand how attention works. On the other hand, we can do the opposite. We can have an understanding of attention in order to understand that the thoughts that we had about the selves were illusion. And this is something that Jonathan Gannery has called attentionalism, the primacy of attention, which Zen makes more salient than Weil and Murdoch, and yet, which is something that both Weil and Murdoch, I think, need. Okay, if I calculate it right, I have 4 minutes left. And I would like to say something about how this can be applied to the attention economy. What can we do with all of these thoughts? Well, I think there is an unpopular, perhaps, or more controversial conclusion here to be drawn. If we accept the concept of attention that I have sketched, which is truth-seeking and which is in various ways, different ways, unselved, then attending to anything can be valuable, even this advertisement that we get fed online, as long as it's really attention. And if we take seriously this concept that Weil and Murdoch introduced, a lot of what the attention economy is trying to capture is not actually attention. The problem then, rather, is that the excess of information and the stimuli that we receive remove our capacity for genuine attention. It's not so much that it's a wrong object, it's just that our capacity for real attention, as understood in this way, is in fact interfered with and removed. Why is that the case? Why is it that we are not actually paying attention on this model? Well, first of all, when we are captured by this information that we get fed by the stimuli, the directedness of our mental life is not truth-seeking. Instead, it's usually instrumental and functional. I'm paying attention to this ad because I want to get some gratification out of it. And therefore, it's also not unselved. It's motivated by desires, fears, guilt, or whatever other more, less morally worthy drives the attention economy is able to appeal to. So what is fundamentally lacking is the element of attention that all 3 views are presented take as very important, which is the idea of emptiness, the idea of waiting. Even if you like the idea of beginner's mind, the idea of being surprised and coming with no preconceptions to the reality that you've encountered, all of these elements of attention are either not encouraged or even not allowed in this social structure in which we seem to be, for some of our time, captivated. So what does that mean? It means that instead of thinking about the fact that our attention is being taken, stolen from us, what we can think about on this model is how do we restore proper attention? How do we actually return real attention to the things that matter, which may be other things, but also to these objects themselves? And this becomes clear when we compare, for example, attending to an ad for hair conditioner and attending to the face of a friend. It seems that the phenomenon itself is not the same. We call it attention, but something different is going on. And I think with these philosophers we talked about, we have the tools to understand why it's different. Even when attention is taken from us, we have different qualities of attention. If you think of you have one pop-up window and the bird that's just landed on your windowsill, they're both cases in which attention is taken. But again, the quality, the background of consciousness and the quality of our consciousness at the moment in which we're attending is different. In one case, it satisfies the requirements of truth-seeking and selflessness. In the other, it does not. So I think what we can do instead is train our attention, and we can take from these 2 philosophers and this one tradition, the tools for training attention in such a way as it restores its fullness according to a truth-seeking, unselfing attention, which they take to be the real attention. For Murdoch, that would be teaching meditation in schools, attending to art, attending to goodness. Attending to art is important because art, for Murdoch and Weil, and following a certain idea of aesthetics, is something that we cannot consume. It's something that inspires our desires, but leaves us completely dissatisfied because we cannot make it our own. And that's a good teaching for the detachment that we need in attention. Weil also stresses school studies like Murdoch does even more, anything that we need to make an effort to learn and challenges our desires. We cannot make languages or maths the way that we want. It's something completely other from us, will teach us attention. And of course, Zen, also meditation, specific practices of meditation, or the use of koans, which disrupt the habitual thinking, which will then create a consciousness which assumes that we know, and then therefore prevent full attention. So what do we do with these practices? Then we can learn to either change the objects of our attention, but through a certain kind of detachment, or change the quality of our attention into full attention, which means that even attending to something which is not inherently particularly valuable can be a valuable experience if it's done in the way that is suggested. And that means that we need to have the right motivation in the background, not the seeking, grasping kind of engagement, which is often the case in the attention economy, but eros, or love of reality, which will in turn yield the right kind of attention, or if we believe Murdoch and Weil, true attention. That's all I have for now. Thank you very much.